Point last this year knows exactly what he's talking about how bad the infrastructure crisis is, and we need a real regional transportation plan. And so, just again, what I initially said is that we are in an economic catastrophe, and we need to spend dollars wisely, but we need to be stimulating the economy, with everything that we do right now. So.
And Paul, let me throw a curveball at you. Is a project like this something that is appropriate for government spending?
Well, it is appropriate for government spending because the Columbia River crossing is part of the I-5 corridor. So that's an interstate highway. And they're replacing an existing bridge, which is crumbling infrastructure and does need to be replaced. The existing bridge is something like 80 years old. Having said that, however, it is good that this project merits being in the book to cut government waste. And in fact, Chapter 10 of our policy guide for Washington State would explain how this crossing could be accomplished to benefit the public for basically half the cost at which it's budgeted, and I'll tell you why. This project, which has been in the design phase for years, has been subject to tremendous political lobbying, and in fact, the goals for the project were laid out during the fat years, during the time when debt and deficit was not a big issue, when Washington State and Oregon seemed to have plenty of money. One political issue that's going on is that Oregon officials are basically holding the project hostage unless light rail is built on the highway bridge and included. That adds about $1 billion to the price tag, and yet studies show that light rail would carry no more than 4% of daily crossings across the bridge, which is why it doesn't reduce traffic congestion ultimately. So you could build a new Columbia River crossing, and we've held forums in the area, and local people say, yes, we need this bridge. We have to replace what's there. But it's designed in such a kind of Taj Mahal way, which has driven the price up to $3.5 billion. You could do it for a lot less than that.
All right, thank you. And now I think we're going to move on to questions from the audience. So as I said, the microphone is up here. You need to first state your name and then state your question, and please speak clearly. And you can direct your question to one or all of the panelists. And please state your question in the form of a question.
My name is Dave Miller, and this is a question for everyone up there. Obviously, there is at least a revenue problem in the sense that revenues have gone down for state and local and federal government since the recession. But there's also, okay, I'll just ask the question. Who's addressing the fact that a lot of people just don't plain pay their taxes, and that the IRS has been systematically stripped of hundreds of auditors who audit the rich in particular, and that there's hundreds of billions of dollars, according to the IRS, which should be taxed, stored overseas, which are not taxed, and I'm not just talking about corporate taxes, individual taxes in thousands of accounts at places like the United Bank of Switzerland. Who's addressing the fact we're not collecting the taxes that actually are owed? Question.
Okay, thank you. Paul, you would like to start?
Sure. So a couple of what may seem a couple of fact corrections. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, federal revenue and state revenue is actually increasing. Washington State is going to spend $2 billion more in the current budget than they did in the last budget. The cuts you hear about, or revenue going down, is revenue is not meeting future expectations. So CBO has a projection of how much they think federal revenues are going to go up. When revenues don't actually meet the projection, they call that a cut. What they really mean is it didn't grow as much as we thought it did. So state revenue at both the federal and the state level, is increasing, just not as fast as the weather report thought that it would. These are projections about the future. Secondly, Congress authorized an additional 600 auditors under the IRS. So the IRS is getting larger and will be auditing more of us. But the questioner is exactly correct that the complexity of the tax code, all the loopholes, all the schedules, allow people who have accountants and lawyers and overseas bank accounts to artificially, well, it's legal, okay, but they're reducing their tax liability. The way to prevent that is to radically simplify the tax code to give the accountants less creativity, less to do, because there are less ways to squirrel away income in a way that's not taxable.
Accountants and lawyers, right? Tax lawyers.
Exactly.
Really quick.
Go ahead,
answer.
Ryan.
One is, I cannot for the life of me remember the name of the coalition that works on offshoring, the issue of kind of people moving their profits offshore to evade taxes. But there's an excellent organization in Washington that does work on that, and I'm happy if I can take, if you want to give me your email, I will send you the information on it since it's beyond my memory right now. But I would say one other thing, which is that, we've seen uneven, because the other issue is just kind of collections, and are they doing a decent job on collections? Leave aside auditing, because that you don't even have to get to auditing, you have to get to collections. And I think we've seen some signs of improvement. I think it's getting a little bit better at the federal level. There was an effort in the last 10 years to contract this out, and that turned out to be more expensive and less effective. So they took it back in-house, and so far that's looking a little better. But, it's still something worth paying attention to. It's not up to snuff. Thank you.
Did you want to add anything, Andy?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to disagree with Paul that there have not been cuts. I mean, I would ask one of the 60,000 people who have been kicked off the basic health plan whether or not there have been budget cuts. There absolutely have been. It's very crucial to bear in mind that during this recession period that we're talking about here, the government has seen an enormous spike in demand for crucial public services that we've seen, and just in the first couple of years of the recession alone, we don't have totally new data at this point, but that the number of people or the share of the population covered by private or employer-sponsored health coverage has plummeted dramatically, while the number on publicly provided insurance has spiked, accordingly. This means that the government has had to respond to the downturn. So the costs of simply maintaining what we normally do as a state have skyrocketed in the past few years. Plus, the state is not immune to inflation. So while we've seen large increases in caseloads and the need for public services, we've also seen an increase in inflation and the cost of providing those services. So there absolutely have been cuts, particularly here at the state level in services. But your broader point about revenue, and I would say that tax evasion or tax avoidance needs to be part of this conversation, that giving resources to the IRS or here at the state level to the Department of Revenue to do audits and to collect taxes that are duly owed has to be part of this, shared responsibility that we have to deal with our immediate problems and our long-term problems.
And Ross, did you have anything to add?
Just agreeing that, the key issue is eliminating loopholes and unnecessary complexity. It's a crime when you have a company like General Electric, which is, doing fabulous innovation in a variety of ways, but really its profit-making center is the 200-person plus legal department, tax law department. They have much more than that in terms of their legal department, that is able to create a situation where they pay no taxes, and that's replicated in corporation after corporation across our country. So absolutely we need to find ways of addressing that.
All right, thank you. Another question.
My name's Helen Gehring, and first of all, I'd like to thank all of you. You're a very persuasive and articulate group. I don't necessarily agree with everything you say, though. Andy comes closest to my philosophy. Let me tell you why. He's the only one of the four of you who have really addressed the needs of the voiceless, the most vulnerable among our citizens. And I'm thinking of, I listen regularly to the NewsHour and a report that came out last week, I think it was from the Pew Foundation, that 1 out of 4 of our children goes to bed hungry. 40% of our high school students in the inner cities do not graduate. Over 30% of our citizens are illiterate. And every year we spend more and more on prisons. If we could only invest what we spend on prisons into our children, I don't think we would have a lot of these other problems. And furthermore, we are not going to be competitive in the marketplace because we aren't producing the next generation. And I think it's Paul.
Can you state your question, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I guess my question is, what suggestions do you have for moving the agenda of this committee onto these very important issues of educating our children, feeding them, and just not cutting the social safety net. I mean, I hope that's going to be the priority of this committee. And how do you suggest that we, bring this question forward?
The question would be how do we as citizens sort of get the information to the people on the super committee what our priorities are? Do any of you have any suggestions on how that could be accomplished? Ryan, why don't you go first?
I mean, I would just say, I think the first suggestion is that, the super committee is a very important and powerful process, but it is going to be about reducing the deficit. It's not going to necessarily be about other long-term goals of the country. That said, I think there's two opportunities. One is make sure that the super committee members know, particularly for you all who have one of your senators, that what you think are the most important things not to cut. I get calls every single day from people saying, hey, you guys work on these kinds of issues. We don't want this cut. And I think, well, then get in there and fight. That's what the defense folks are doing. That's what everybody who's in this report is doing. All the industries are out there right now fighting to make sure that they don't get cut, and so people need to get in there and fight for the things that are most important to them, and that's one important element of the process. I would say, as a little institutional plug, you could offer an alternative. But I think you got to fight for the things that you think should not be cut.
Paul?
I'll second that, and I think I mentioned in the introduction that my wife and I work with foster kids, and there is nobody in society who's more voiceless than they are. They have no political clout, they have no lobbyists, they have no organization, and a lot of times they don't even have homes. So programs are needed to help them. Foster homes are always needed. A lot of the troubles that you mentioned had to do with public education, which, if you think about it, is a government function already, and it has massive problems. 1 out of 3 public high school students fail to graduate. In private schools, the graduation rate is 90%. Seattle spends more than $13,000 per child to educate children, and yet has very poor academic outcomes. So the best message I think that we as citizens could give to the super committee is to sort of open our minds about the assumption that because a program has a nice apple pie label, oh, it's for education, it's for schools, you should not assume that that is actually helping children. This is particularly true in federal education spending, which is might as well be on Pluto as far as my kid's local school is concerned. So decisions that Arnie Duncan makes in some office building in Washington, D.C., really have almost no impact at all, no benefit, I can tell you, on the foster kids I work with or with the schools that they attend, because it's so distant. So if the super committee was looking at education funding, which causes politicians to just run for the hills, the best message I think we can give as citizens is at least be open to the idea that if a program has a nice sounding mom and apple pie label, maybe that money is not really being spent to help people. Maybe it's just funding bureaucracies and special interests, and we should at least listen to the idea of cutting that spending.
So Andy, let me ask you, do you agree that maybe we can make smart cuts to education and welfare and other programs, the social safety net?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to approach this smart. I think when we're talking about deficit reduction and debt reduction overall, the big driver of all of this is healthcare costs. We care passionately about education, which is a pretty small share of the federal budget, actually. If we're going to seriously reduce the debt, we need to figure out how to reduce the rise in healthcare costs. And that requires that we do something that is system-wide, that we can't simply shift the costs. For example, there's been a proposal to raise the eligibility age for Medicaid to 67. The Kaiser Family Foundation found that that would save the federal government around $6 billion, but would add about $12 billion to businesses and individuals and young people in the exchanges. So economy-wide, it doesn't help the problem. We need to do smart things to reduce the rise in healthcare costs. Now, in the healthcare bill that was passed, the American Health Care Act, that has about everything we dreamed of that we know might work to reduce healthcare costs in it. But it's not going to happen in 10 years. There's tons of pilot programs and studies that are set up. Those things are going to take time to come to fruition to see which ones actually work at driving down costs, as I said, system-wide. So